So Black Ops 6 has obviously been very in the moment. It's the big game right now, and it's the one that most people are playing. And it's always interesting to me to check the minimum and recommended specifications for games when they come out, especially games like, your Battlefields, your Call of Duties, your Delta Forces, those kinds of games. And it's always interesting to actually check because, in my opinion, Call of Duty specifically has not ran very well for the last few years, and a lot of that is to do with shader optimization and shader loading and batching. And to me, it's been a little bit of a nightmare to play Call of Duty games. Not only the network issues, but also the sort of the lag spikes that happen, and especially with the shader stuff, it's very unstable, and there's a lot of lagging, especially at the beginning of matches. But I will say that the previous Black Ops Cold War, in many people's opinion, not the best game in the world, but it ran well on the computer that I had at that time, which was, at that point, it was a Ryzen 1700 32 gigs of RAM and a 1660 Ti. Um, and it ran well on that system. And that is the sort of system that I think a lot of people still have. I think it's more popular than the mainstream would think. And so, yeah, to get into the point of the video, I thought let's sort of see what is the PC in between the minimum and the recommended specifications. And let's kind of check, what a PC like that would look like, how it would do in a game like this, and is that the optimal sort of PC for a game like this. Obviously, the best PC is going to be the best, but I'm talking budget. I'm talking what you can squeeze out of your computer in a game like this, because this is the new game at the moment. So with that said, let's go between the specs and let's see what the adequate Black Ops 6 PC does. Let's do it. So according to Activision itself, these are the minimum specifications that you can see on the left. It's quite low, actually, and I assume this is obviously to run it at the worst possible setting with the best possible upscaling and, resolution, helping technology, all of that kind of AI stuff. So we are talking Windows 10, of course, 64-bit. We are talking a Ryzen 5 1400, and that is a 4-core processor. A i5 6600, I think that's a 4-core processor. So we are talking first gen Ryzen and 6th gen Intel. Now, I do think you can play the game on like a 4th gen or a 5th gen Intel, maybe even a 3rd gen, like a 3rd gen i7. But I think these are just sort of like the guidelines. And same with AMD. I think you can play it on previous before Ryzen CPUs, but it's not necessarily going to work very well. For the video card, we are talking an RX 470. I think that's a 4 GB card, and the GTX 960, which also comes in 2 and 4 GB variants. And we are talking an Intel Arc A580. And now I think they use the A580 because obviously Intel's graphics cards don't stretch that far back, so there isn't as much of a sample size. Video memory, 2 gigs, so that's the 960. And you need 102 gig of storage space. It does say SSD, but it could be hard drive, but I do think a game like this you will want to run from an SSD. Recommended, we are talking latest update Windows 10 or Windows 11, probably going to want to play on Windows 11. A Ryzen 1600X, which is a 6-core CPU, first gen Ryzen Zen 1. And we are talking an i7 6700K, so that's still 6th gen Intel, and I think that might be an 8-core CPU, but it might be a 6-core, I'm not sure. 12 gigs of RAM recommended. That's a little bit strange, but it is what it is. It's obviously, these days RAM, you don't really do 12 gig or 24 gig. You do 8 gigs or 16 gigs or 32 gigs. That's just, in terms of gaming, that's how people approach, the specs. And then recommended is an RX 6600 XT, which is a nice card. It's a good card for HD gaming. It's an 8 gig card, and we are talking a 1080 Ti or a 3060 recommended. And those are 11 and 12 gig cards, each. So those are some good HD sort of specs for the recommended settings, and we are talking 8 gigs of video memory recommended. So I'm not even going to look at the 4K specs. I mean, it's not necessary for this. This is just the sort of optimal HD budget performance sort of specs that we are going to be taking a look at. So basically what I've done is I've gone in between these two. And now there is a big variety of parts that you can choose in between these two. I mean, obviously between a Ryzen 1400 and a 1600, there's, you know, I don't even know if a 1500 exists, but you know, there isn't that much difference between those two CPUs, and I do even think it might be better to just go third gen Ryzen because it's going to cost more or less the same, or even second gen. Like you could get a Ryzen 2700, which I know isn't technically in between these two, but when it comes to CPUs, you're either going to pay $10 or $50, and the, you know, second hand, and the difference in performance between those sort of price ranges isn't going to be that big, so you might as well go for the middle one. Like a $30 one would be like a 3500X. I've seen them go for $30 online. Ryzen Gen 3 CPUs. So you could get like a Zen 3 Ryzen CPU, which is a 6-core CPU. Like you could get a 3600 for about $40, which, you know, I would just do that. So in between doesn't really make sense for the CPUs, and so I've just gone with the 2700 because you're going to pay the same for a 2700 more or less than you're going to pay for a 1600X. For the RAM, you know, the in between for this would be 10 gigs, but it's sort of the same thing. Like you're not going to go 12 gigs because it's not going to cost, it's going to cost $5 more to go 16. And so I think the in-between, like I said, would be 10 gigs, but who's going to have an 8 gig and a 2 gig stick? Like if it's a leftover computer and it's a DDR3 older system, that makes sense, but that's not really what I'm talking about. Most people now have either 16 gigs or 32 gigs, and most people I think do have 32 gigs now. So it doesn't really make sense to sort of say 10 gigs, but I guess that would be the in-between. But what it really comes down to with this is the graphics card. That's sort of the only part that really matters in terms of in-between, because the diminishing returns on the CPU and the RAM, it doesn't make sense to go for the in-between for this. But if you wanted to do that, that would be a, well, I guess if the 1500 existed, which I don't think it does, I'm not sure. But let's just say a 1600 non-X would be the in-between. But that's just going to be a normal 6-core CPU. Like I said, you might as well go for a 3600 because it's not going to cost much more. For the RAM, you would go 10 gigs, which again doesn't make sense. But here's the real, you know, thing that matters, and that's the graphics card. So the graphics card, that is sort of the in-between one between an RX 470 and an RX 6600 XT, and a 960 from NVIDIA and a 1080 Ti would be, you know, the RX 580, you know, the full version, the one with the 8 gigs that's not the dumbed down one, and a 1660 Super or Ti. That's sort of what I think would be the in-between versions of these specs. And those cards are a 8 gig and 6 gig card. The 1660 is a 6 gig card, and the RX 580 is an 8 gig card. And so I think that's sort of the in-between between these two systems, which I think would be, according to them, the adequate PC. So you're not going to be minimum, you're not going to be recommended. So what would a system like that cost? I've opened up some examples on Amazon, and you're looking at around $400 to $550, more or less. Now this is excuse me, this is an example of a company that I look at quite often, this STG company, and This, I think, so these listings, obviously, they're not very descriptive. They sort of don't always tell you exactly what you're getting. So this might be a DDR3 system, I'm not too sure. But this is just an example. You are getting a 1660 Ti 6 gigabytes, or you can opt for an RX 580. Now, this does say 32 gigs, so I do believe it would be, well, it does say DDR4, so for that price, it's not too bad. This is actually quite a well-priced computer. An RX 580, I'm not sure why it says 16 gig, I don't think that exists. Let's see. Yeah, this, I don't know if this is misleading or just a mistake, but that doesn't make sense. But this is a good example of the in-between PC. So this is an RX 580 60, almost said 16 gig, 8 gig, an i7 6700, 32 gigs of DDR4 RAM, 2 terabyte SSD space, which is more than enough, and a bunch of extras that doesn't matter for the sake of this video. So obviously, like I said, you would like to go for a 6-core CPU. This is a 4-core, apparently, the 6700. And while that will be fine, it's not going to be optimal. I think it would be much better to optimize and pay $10 more for a 6-core CPU. But for the in-between PC, I think this makes sense. And this is just under $600. The 1660 Ti version of this is $10 less. And this, it doesn't say which CPU, but it, let's see. It just says Core i7 and 32 gigs of RAM, so that makes me think it's going to be DDR3. Now, I don't know that, but that's just what I would think, because they would have said if it wasn't. So yeah, DDR3 and a 1660 Ti 6 gig. So obviously you would want to go for DDR4 if you can, but this won't be the end of the world, but you're not going to have a lot of upgrade room, and you are going to be 2 generations of RAM back if you do go with this. And this also means it's going to be sort of like probably a fourth gen i7, which officially isn't even supported, so technically this wouldn't be in between, but in terms of the graphics, it would be. Taking a look at another one. This is a 1660 Super, also a Core i7, 16 gigs of RAM. And yeah, I don't like that these sort of listings do this thing where they don't say exactly what it is, because that just makes me think that they are trying to sort of hide something. And this is also DDR3, so these aren't the best examples, but it is a little bit difficult to find exactly what I'm talking about. But I think this is more or less what you're going to be looking at for a DDR4 system with a 6-core CPU and a 1660 Ti. Take a look at this last one here. Now, I'm not sure which company this is, but this one has a i7 processor, 32 gigs of RAM, a 1 terabyte SSD, and an RX 580. But you can also opt for a 1660 for $100 more or less, which is a little bit silly. Again, it doesn't say which CPU or RAM, so it's going to be DDR3 again. So this is something you would want to avoid. And, well, this does say DDR4, so this might be fine. So it's probably going to be a 6th gen i7 then. But it doesn't matter exactly which computer you look at. This one is the best one in terms of the ones that we have looked at. But even this, like you can see, there's a lot of cost-cutting measures being taken. But yeah, the point is just it's going to cost you around $500 to build a PC like this. And you should go for a 6-core CPU. I would say go for 16 gigs of RAM and go for an RX 580 or a 1660 Super or Ti. So that's more or less the computer we're looking at. So let's see how it does and how this sort of thing will perform in game, and how your $500 well, mostly used parts PC is going to run in Black Ops 6. Let's do it. So this is Black Ops 6 playing on 1080p basic, and this is getting around 86 right now. Now the specs, like I said, the 1660 Ti. The 1660 Super will be close to this in terms of performance. It's, you know, the cards are quite similar. And in terms of the rest, this is a Ryzen 2600. So that's what I said with the CPU. You wanna try and get at least a 6-core CPU. So maybe something like an 8500 or a 2600 or a 3600, and all of those are going to be sub $50 realistically. For the RAM, we have 16 gigs. Now I know technically that isn't the adequate amount, but that's the amount people have. I mean, let's just be honest. And we are sticking around 90 FPS, and of course this is the lowest graphics, but it's a smooth experience. You know, it's running well. It's running without any lag, really. The 1% low is quite high at 60. And the frame time is very smooth as well. So it's a good result. Of course, this is the lowest setting, but it's still a good result. Okay. Let's do... Okay, so this is going to be basic, but with FSR, which is AMD's upscaler. And it's around the same FPS. You will have some visual artifacting and some quality, decreases here and there with this kind of thing. But it does help for stability. That frame time is very smooth. And the 1% low is actually lower than what it was without FSR, which is surprising. But I'm not a big fan of upscaling and these sort of AI-based resolution modifiers and stuff. It's not something that I like to use. So this is probably what I would play at 1080p balanced, and we are getting around 75 FPS, which is quite good. This is of course a different map, but that's something that Call of Duty does well. The continuity between their maps in terms of the FPS level staying more or less around the same place. It's actually very impressive. The 1% low is at around 50, and the frame time is very smooth. We are using quite a lot of RAM, so I would say go for 16 gigs of RAM for this, because this is using 14 gigs of RAM just for the gameplay. And remember, Windows needs RAM to run as well. So make sure you have at least 16 gigs of RAM. VRAM, we are using around 4 gigs of the available 6, because this is a 1660. And overall, a very good result. Very playable. It looks good. I mean, it's balanced, so it's the normal setting. And quite impressive. Let's see how it does at a... I'm not going to try this one for FSR, because I'm not that interested in it. So let's try extreme graphics. So this is the best well, not the best, but it's almost the best graphics in the game in terms of settings. And this is getting around 60, which is actually quite impressive. Now you can see there's a difference in how it feels. It's a little bit more stuttery, a little bit slower on the response. So I probably wouldn't use this preset, but it's impressive to me that it can handle this preset on a system like this. Because obviously it's going to look the best. But I would play 4 FPS in this, so I would go for the balanced preset. Now with this one, this is where FSR might help you if you're someone that likes to use it. So it hasn't made a big difference, about 5 FPS better. The 1% lows are low now, and that's to be expected with a visual quality like this. But all in all, still this is a playable result at the highest settings. So the adequate PC is very adequate. It actually does quite well. Now, of course, this is a new thing, the frame generation, and this is going to help a lot. But in theory, frame generation in a multiplayer game doesn't make that much sense to me, because if you think about it, let's say you generate every third frame, right? Does that then mean that you miss network interpolation? Because that third generated frame, if you're running at 100 frames a second, that means 33% of those frames are going to be fake, right? So does that then mean that you lose 33% of your response time, because the player is only going to be moving for 60% of that, 66% of that of that, of that frame. So does that mean overall you will be 33% slower? Or am I thinking about this incorrectly? I'm not actually sure how it works, but just if I think about it, that's how I sort of approach it. Now, of course, if you run at, let's say you run at 200 FPS, and you only generate, let's say 50 frames, so 25% frame generation. That's going to be a bit better because you're only losing a quarter, but that's still quite a lot if you think about it. So obviously this is going to run at a high frame rate, but it might be at the detriment of input response. Sorry to get a little bit technical. I'm not even sure if that's how it works, but that's just in my analytical mind, that's how I would approach it. But I might be wrong. Maybe it doesn't work like that at all. Let me know if you know how it works. Let me know. It is an interesting technology, and it obviously helps a lot with performance. That frame time is buttery smooth. That thing is chugging along very well. And the 1% lows are a high refresh rate, so this is going to be a very smooth experience. I'm just not sure if it's smooth on the network side. So with that said, this has been the adequate Call of Duty Black Ops 6 computer, and it's very adequate. It's a very good result, and with the technologies that games have now, even slower computers like this one will be buffed and will be able to play games at respectable frame rates with very smooth frame times. So it's good to see, and it looks like this is a well optimized game. I have to say that because in the past Call of Duty hasn't always been. I've not had a chance to try this yet, but I will do later in the month, and I will see how that goes. Thank you to GamerMax for supplying the test. I really enjoy it when people do these sort of tests and put it out, because people like me can then react to it and say this is a sort of possibility. So thank you to GamerMax. Check out his channel, and thank you for watching the video, and I hope to see you in the next one.